All right, so basically just going to talk about some definitions first. There are two different sort of elements at play today that we're going to talk about outside of the Go Smart cycle, and that is a subcycle and a flexible page set. So looking at some definitions, we're just going to pull all the way back so that we're sort of on the same page. When we talk about a grant opportunity, that's the entire process in which an applicant might participate. So that's maybe an intent to apply, that's them filling out an application, that's them getting funded, spending the money, telling you how they spent it, closing out the whole thing. That's what we consider an opportunity. So within Go Smart, a cycle is sort of a single item listed on the applicant's current programs and applications tab, and that can include an intent to apply, an application, an interim report, and or a final report. So a grant opportunity very well should include a Go Smart cycle, and then on top of that may go on to include a subcycle or a flexible page set. Let me show you what I mean. So when I say sort of a single item listed on the current programs and applications tab, we're looking at an applicant here, and they see this one bounded box with the name Community Support 2018. That's the Go Smart cycle. Now that might be your whole grant opportunity if your grant opportunity only includes an intent to apply, the application, an interim report, and or a final report. But your grant opportunity might include a Go Smart cycle in this bounded box, and then might go on to include a separate page set like an invoice or a reimbursement form or any number of other possibilities. And so that's what I want to make that distinction of, is that this is a cycle as far as Go Smart software is concerned. This is also a cycle as far as Go Smart software is concerned, but in your eyes and your applicant's eyes, they're all part of the same grant opportunity, right? So just to further lay out one other thing, when I say that this is a cycle as well, perhaps an invoice like this, it's really one single page set. And so just as a reminder, a page set is any group of pages in a Go Smart cycle that combines to make up a single entity, like an application or a final report or an invoice or an interim report, whatever it may be. One single page set is whatever is going to be accessible via each of these links. So here we have 4 page sets. Here we have 3 page sets. Though they're all the same thing, it's going to be a copy of that invoice, and we've just allowed here multiple invoices to be submitted. So each of these is its own page set, but it's all the same sort of construct. It's all that same application in the form of an invoice that your folks can come back to and resubmit over and over again. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Okay. So yeah, so we looked at a Go Smart cycle. That's going to be, again, just that whole bounded box. And then let's jump into what a subcycle is. So a subcycle is going to be created from the Program Cycles tab by clicking that Extend Cycle. So I don't know if you've seen that before, but let's say you're in a program, or I'm sorry, a cycle, and you've come all the way to the bottom. Your last option here is to extend that cycle. And what that's basically going to do is it's going to make a clone of the application from this cycle. So if we're extending Community Support 2019, we make it a subcycle of that by extending it. What we're basically doing is creating a whole new clone, including all of the applicant's data, in a new cycle that we might call invoice, that we might call year 2, we might call it reimbursement form, whatever it is that we're making the subcycle for, to create a new form for your folks to access. It's going to be able to clone all that data that they included in the application page set of the initial cycle. Now it can also include none of that information. Basically what you're going to do when you click that Extend Cycle button, make sure that your folks who you want to move forward to that next item are in one of 3 statuses. They need to be in pending, approved, or funded. So right now we've got Diana in funded, and Susan, and we've got Erica in pending. So those are the 3, let's say, that we want to move them forward because they've been funded and they're also ready to maybe see the invoice or to do the next step or to work on the second year. So we'll come into our front-end manager, program cycles, extend cycle. Now what we have is 3 folks in that secondary sub-cycle. So you'll manage it just like you do any other cycle, any other application, and to your applicants, it's going to look, again, like a separate entity. So even though this is a sub-cycle of this cycle, it's going to show up to your applicants as though it's a separate piece. But when you create that sub-cycle, you can determine which pages of this application are now going to be part of this piece. And if you're creating an invoice, you probably don't want almost any of that information to carry forward. But let's say your first page does have some budget information that you asked for. Maybe you want your folks to see that when they're filling out their invoice. Then you can designate that page to show up. And then you can also create a new page in which you're going to make your invoice form. And so that's going to look a little different than it does currently when you're creating a cycle. When you're in a sub-cycle, we're in this invoice, now you see this option that we don't usually see, which is to hide or display a page. And that's what I'm talking about when I say you might make a new sub-cycle that has none of your initial pages from the original, in which case you'd hide everything. Or maybe you want to show a budget page or an information page that you want to carry over into the invoice. In that case, you could display it. And then if you want to create a new page to house all of your invoice questions, just like you would in a regular cycle, you'd add that custom narrative page, call it your invoice, add it on, and then add your questions just like you would to a regular cycle page. And then now, when your folks hop into that invoice, they're going to see the pages you've opted to hide and display, and they're going to see your new page with the invoice.
You said this could be used for a second year cycle as well.
Uh-huh.
So would the first year need to be still showing as active? It would be in its own box, and then the next one would show below that.
It would show up just like this if you use the sub-cycle. Now there's another option. If you don't do an interim report in your initial cycle or in your opportunity in general, you could use your interim report as your second year, but that does not pull the data through the way that a sub-cycle does.
Okay.
It depends which is more valuable to you. If you feel like it's more important that it's all sort of in one bounded box together, but that the data doesn't pull through, we could use the interim report. If you want to pull that data through, then I think a sub-cycle is the best way to go.
Okay, great.
Sure. So some other things to note, though, about a sub-cycle is that it's only going to appear to the applicants who were in one of those three statuses. So let's say you have somebody who completed the initial application, but they are not in one of those statuses when you go to make your sub-cycle, then this sub-cycle will not ever show up to them. So the biggest thing that sort of sets a sub-cycle apart from a flexible page set, which we'll talk about in a second, is that a sub-cycle is created one time, and everybody who needs to be a part of that needs to be in one of those statuses at that time. So you can't sort of create your sub-cycle and then throw people in as they reach whatever point they need to be at. So it only works well if you have like a pretty cut and dry sort of deadline for your application, deadline for when folks get funded, deadline for when everybody moves forward together.
Okay.
All right? You cannot include additional page sets in a sub-cycle. So for a sub-cycle, you could keep making that initial invoice or whatever it is that you create. You could make that available multiple times, but you cannot create an interim report or a final report on this piece. So if you've made a sub-cycle for invoices, your folks will have to come back here to finish their interim report and their final report. You wouldn't create it here and sort of have it tagged onto this.
Right. Okay.
Okay. You can, however, panel a sub-cycle, but there are two interesting things that the system does not do. It does not carry forward support material, and it does not carry forward data that was put into a budget table. So if you, for instance, let's say you asked for some demographic questions in the initial application and you don't want your panelists to see that, you could create a sub-cycle, hide that demographics page, and then have your folks panel the sub-cycle. But very important to notice that, like I said, the support materials don't automatically carry over, nor does budget information. So it would be a pretty niche purpose where you wouldn't need those things and you'd want to hide the demographics. But it is plausible to panel that piece as a second round, or tertiary round, or even further. All right? All right, so that is the bulk of what to know about a subcycle and how to use that. Let me go on to talk about flexible page sets, and we can sort of compare the two, and then you can let me know if you have questions about one versus the other. All right? So unlike a subcycle, a flexible page set is going to be just its own cycle. And again, it's going to show up separately to your applicants. So this is an example that you guys might use for this instance where you have folks who filled out the application in your custom site, and then you want to invite them here to work on their final report. So you might create what we deem a flexible page set just because it's not going to use the GoSmart cycle in the typical workflow, but the system will think of it as a regular GoSmart cycle. So what we did here is we created Project Support 2018 Final Report as its own cycle. So to you, that's going to look, like I said, just like any other cycle. But rather than calling it just Project Support 2018, you actually include the language Final Report so that what shows up to the applicant on their list is Final Report. And then you'd want to make sure that you include in your messaging, this is a Final Report form to be filled out by somebody who's filled out the application in custom or over at this URL, because that may make more sense to them. And then you basically would go on to construct it similarly to how you would construct a regular cycle, but what would throw you is that you would be building your final report pages in the Peach subset, which again to you as an admin is, you know the Peach as being your application pages, but your applicants would need those pages to be built in the Peach subset because that's the first thing that the system allows them to see. So if you built them as green final report pages and you did not build Peach application pages, the system wouldn't really know how to start. So what you'll be doing if you want to go this route is you would build in the Peach pages final report page 1, whatever that looks like, and then build in your questions just like you always would. And then you'd continue to add on to your Peach pages to create that final report. And then your applicants would not be the wiser at all. They don't know that color coding system. They would just see, just like they do any other time, start and then edit if they've already started to work on it. And then from your perspective, you would manage it very much the same. So you'd still come into your grant manager. You'd still be seeing, you'd select your final report, and then you'd still have the opportunity to review all of this information, just like you always did by clicking the App PDF rather than the final report PDF. But again, that's all on the internal admin side, so it's just a matter of you sort of changing the way you're thinking about things. And rather than looking for green final report pages and the FR PDF, you would know that you're looking for the Peach and the App PDF while you're looking for your folks' final reports. Now, some other things to think about is that this might be the way you want to go to create your invoice, because again, it's going to appear exactly the same to your applicant, whether or not you make it a subcycle or a flexible page set. If we called this Community Support 2018 invoice, you could do exactly the same. The benefit there is that it's available to all of your registered applicants. They don't have to have been part of that pre-application, to be seeing the invoice. It also means that they could enter it at any time. So if you have like a rolling deadline, or if you have folks who just might have missed that subcycle, this gives you the opportunity to actually make it a little bit more flexible for folks to get into it at whatever time is appropriate for them. It also allows you the opportunity to build an interim report or a final report if that's something that you wanted to do. Now, I can't think of too many examples where you'd want to sort of be building a whole second set of items, but if that were the case, this gives you more flexibility to actually build on those additional page sets, whereas in the sub-cycle, remember, you can only build that initial sub-cycle, and then you have to return to the initial cycle for the interim and the final report.
Oh, so you're saying in the flexible page set you could have both an invoice and a final report?
Uh-huh, you could do that.
Okay.
So if you
Okay.
felt like, it made more sense to your folks to sort of see all that stuff together versus returning to the initial, then yeah, that's the way you might want to do that.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Now the only thing there is, for either of these processes, either the sub-cycle or the flexible page set, your folks will be getting a brand new application number that differs from whatever this is. So another thing to think about is, do you want your final report and your interim report to sort of be housed in the same area where they could be pulled in the same type of report, where they would all align with the same application number? Or are you less concerned about that? Because you can still always pull reports, you might just have to collate them.
Mm-hmm.
If you build your flexible page set here and your final report here, those will have different application numbers and they won't be able to be part of the exact same report as your application. But again, you could pull them separately and then just collate them. So something to think about.
So just to make sure I'm understanding, so the sub-cycle, an application number gets created, but it's not related to those users' applications in the main cycle.
Exactly.
Okay.
They're going to be assigned a new application number.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. But again, you'll still be able to pull reports of this and reports of this, and you can always line it up by any other item, like their organization name or their username, any other sort of means of making sure that you have that data together.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. All right. Let me just look through my bulleted list again really fast, see if I missed anything. So you would create this, like I said, a little bit different than a sub-cycle. You would create it just like you would a new cycle, but all new cycles still need to be created off of an existing cycle. So you'd still have to come in, choose your cycle, maybe your most recent one, and then rather than doing extend cycle, you would choose create new cycle. And then you would just delete and modify as needed to make the invoice or the final report, whatever it is. All right? This can also be submitted multiple times, so it still works really well as an invoice if you want people to submit that over and over again with a new request. As I said, it is going to appear to all of your registered applicants or your individuals or organizations if you set that setting. But if you wanted it to be private just to folks who perhaps finished the application and were funded, then you'd have to create an invitational passcode and then provide your folks with that passcode. And that's a lot easier than it sounds, but you would just have to go that extra step versus creating a sub-cycle, which would automatically only make it available to the folks who you already sort of pre-vetted who should be in that pool to see it. That's a bit of a difference. And then, of course, just like any other cycle, the application page set of a flexible page set can be paneled just like any other application page set.
What is the difference between a flexible page set and a regular cycle?
Sure, almost nothing except for how you're going to treat it. So the thing to think about is a flexible page set is really any cycle that isn't starting with an application.
Okay.
Or any item you need to make that isn't one of these 4 items. So let's say your cycle is really robust and you do have an intent to apply and an application and an interim report and a final report, but you also want to create an invoice, then you'd have to make a flexible page set because there isn't sort of a space here to create an invoice, either like as your interim report or your final report. But if you were the type of agency who doesn't do an interim report, we could sort of use that slot for an invoice if it made sense. So it really just depends on your workflow. But the difference there is that an interim report cannot be submitted multiple times. So again, even if you don't use the interim report slot, but you want an invoice to be able to be submitted several times if they're making several requests, then you'd still want to use a flexible page set so that you could have them submit it over and over again.
Okay, and then if you did it that way, is there a way to limit how many times? Like we could say like 3? Okay.
Sure, for sure. It's probably a feature you haven't been using because by and large, most people only want one application per user. But on the program cycles page, one of the first settings is allow applications, and this is what determines how many times folks can submit. So if you know people could submit as many as 5 times, but no more than 5 times, then you'd want to set that to 5.
Okay.
Yeah. But just as a quick outro, some best practices are to always try to include the intent to apply, the application, the interim report, and the final report page sets in a single GoSmart cycle. So even though we definitely just said, that you could build an invoice and a final report separately, I would say best practice is to try to house those things together and just use a flexible page set for like an invoice or a reimbursement form. But certainly, you guys use the system however you see fit. And then utilize the sub-cycle if you need to carry forward data, if the page set should only be available to prior applicants, or if you can move everyone forward at the same time. And then a flexible page set is going to be best for you when all registered users should have access, or all users may access it at different times, and if the data does not need to be associated with other existing cycles, meaning that you don't need to be showing them a previously filled out page from the application while they're working on this new piece. All right. And then, as always, you can reach out to me while you're building. If you have questions, we can go over this together and sort of build the first one together. You can look at the knowledge base for any information about using this. And then there are 2 specific guides. There's a flexible page set guide that'll sort of walk you through best practices there and how to actually make that page set. And then just the launching the additional cycles guide, which also helps you with creating any new cycle, whether it's flexible or not. All right? Yeah, no problem. Anything else before we hop off?
No, I think that's great for now.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer.
Okay, bye.
Bye.